Ryan Clark has finally revealed what Stephen A. Smith told him months before ESPN fired him. At first, Ryan didn't think much of it, but as he slowly started getting pushed out behind the scenes, he realized Stephen A. had seen the writing on the wall long before anyone else. Let me break it down. Ryan Clark was on the set of NFL Live on a Monday afternoon, doing the job he'd done for over a decade, when a text landed on his phone. It came from the showrunner. It told him to call his boss. He did during the break. He got a text from his showrunner that told him to call his boss, and he called his boss in the break. He was told a story was about to leak about his dismissal from the network. That's the moment ESPN chose to tell him he was done. Not in an office, not on a phone call scheduled for the next morning. In the middle of a broadcast, in a commercial break, with cameras still rolling on the show he was supposed to finish. Clark learned during a commercial break Monday that he was part of a mass layoff at ESPN, and he never returned to the broadcast. The plan had been different. Initially, ESPN planned to tell Clark that he was let go on Tuesday morning, in line with other layoffs. But media inquiries had led the network to fear that Clark would find out. When word started to circulate about how it all went down, Clark didn't stay quiet. TMZ ran a report suggesting he wasn't actually forced off the set, that he and the network had mutually agreed it was better for him not to return. Clark shot that down himself, in his own words, posting directly in response to the story. He quoted a TMZ Sports post about his abrupt exit, writing, "I wasn't forced, I asked. Should I be done now? The answer was yes." That's not a mutual decision. That's a man asking permission to leave the set of a show he no longer worked for. And here's the part that made the whole thing sting even more. The guy sitting closest to him, on camera every single day, found out he had no say in it either. Stephen A. Smith didn't hear about Clark's firing from a memo. He found out and went straight to his own platform, visibly rattled, and let the sports world hear exactly how he felt about it. My brother, Ryan Clark, a person that I consider to be arguably the best NFL analyst in America, is no longer a member of ESPN. A visibly distraught Smith told his online audience, adding he couldn't tell his audience how much that hurt. But Smith didn't stop at grief. He revealed something that turned this into a bigger story than just another round of layoffs. He'd actually been consulted before the decision was made, and he'd argued against it. Asked if he'd been consulted on his feelings, Smith admitted he was, and said of course he told them they had to keep Clark, but that he doesn't get to make those decisions and doesn't get to ignore the fiscal and financial circumstances of the job. Bosses at Bristol asked the biggest name in the building what he thought, and then did the opposite of what he told them. That's the setup. A network that valued Clark enough to worry he'd read about his own firing online, but not enough to keep him. A colleague who tried to stop it and got overruled anyway. And now, days later, Clark has come out and confirmed there was a warning that came long before any of this. A warning from Smith himself, delivered months in advance, that something like this could be coming. Clark laid it out himself, sitting with his own words this time, no reporter filtering it through a headline. He made clear from the jump that whatever language ESPN wanted to use, he wasn't interested in softening it. "So let me put this to bed. I wasn't laid off. I was fired," Clark said, not downsized, not restructured out of a role. Fired. He wanted that distinction on the record before anything else got said. And then came the piece that reframes the entire firing, the piece that gives this story its title. Clark said he had gotten a heads up about a potential split between himself and the network last summer, from fellow ESPN analyst Stephen A. Smith. Months before the text message, before the commercial break, before any of it, Smith had already told him something was coming. To understand why that warning mattered so much, you have to understand what Ryan Clark actually was, inside that building for over a decade. This wasn't some analyst who'd been around for a season or two. Easy to forget, easy to swap out. In more than a decade at ESPN, Clark had been a contributor to the network's top shows, like NFL Live, SportsCenter, and First Take. He joined right after his playing career ended, and he built himself into one of the faces people associated with ESPN's football coverage. Clark joined ESPN as an analyst in March 2015 and was making more than $2 million a year, according to sources. He didn't just show up and read a script either. He won recognition for it. Clark won a Sports Emmy for Outstanding Personality Studio Analyst in 2023. That's not a participation trophy in a crowded industry. That's the industry telling you that you're one of the best doing this specific job, on a specific set, in a specific chair. For a guy who played 13 years in the NFL as a defensive back, then reinvented himself as a TV voice good enough to win an Emmy for it. This was supposed to be the second act that actually worked out. So how does a guy like that end up getting a text mid-broadcast telling him to call his boss? The reporting says this had been building for a while, and it wasn't really a mystery once you look at the pieces. His job was allegedly in jeopardy since February's Super Bowl, and ESPN executives had soured on him after incidents with colleague Peter Schrager, both on and off the air. That's a specific colleague, a specific tension, and it traces back to something that happened on live television that a lot of people saw in real time. It happened on Get Up, and it wasn't subtle. In September 2025, Clark and Schrager had a viral on-air spat after Schrager defended Cowboys wide receiver CeeDee Lamb. Clark didn't hold back either, pointing a finger at his colleague on camera and telling him directly that some things shouldn't be hashed out on television, while also making it clear what he thought of Schrager's playing background versus his own. That clip didn't just disappear after the show ended. It kept circulating, kept getting brought up, and according to the reporting, it kept costing him internally. That tension reportedly didn't stay confined to the one blow-up either. Sources described ongoing friction between the two that went beyond the single on-air moment, friction that carried weight with the people making staffing decisions at the top. And then there was the Super Bowl question. ESPN was gearing up for something historic, their first time airing the Super Bowl since ABC last held the rights, going back to 2006. Clark had reportedly been expected to be part of that, but somewhere along the way, he says, he started to notice he wasn't being pulled into the planning the way he expected. Clark himself confirmed this feeling once he finally spoke publicly. He said he felt there were signs throughout the season regarding his impending dismissal, including what he described as a lack of involvement in ESPN's scheduling around Super Bowl LXI. That's a man who'd been building toward the biggest broadcast night of his network's calendar, watching himself slowly get moved out of the conversation around it and reading the room correctly before the network ever said a word to him directly. So by the time that text came through mid-broadcast, it wasn't coming out of nowhere for Clark internally. It was coming out of nowhere in terms of timing and method. Nobody expects to get fired on a commercial break, but the writing in his own account had been on the wall for months. That's exactly why the warning from Smith carries the weight it does. It wasn't a random rumor floating around a newsroom. It was a friend, inside the same building, seeing the same signs Clark was starting to notice himself, and deciding to say something before it became official. And Clark wasn't the only name that fell in that same window. This wasn't a solo casualty. It was part of something bigger hitting the building all at once, which is exactly why nobody at ESPN was fully shocked when the name started coming out. Clark's firing didn't happen in isolation. It landed in the middle of a much larger gutting of on-air and behind-the-camera talent, tied to bigger business moves happening above everyone's head. Front Office Sports had reported in June that the network was bracing for a larger round of cuts, associated with the ESPN-NFL network merger, with cuts expected to affect both on- and off-camera personnel. This wasn't a decision made about one analyst who'd had one bad on-air moment. This was corporate restructuring, dressed up in individual pink slips. The list of names that went down alongside him tells you how wide this wave actually was. The move was part of a fresh wave of cost-cutting layoffs that also hit Cam Newton, Carl Ravech, Bart Scott, and Tom Pelissero, among others. Cam Newton had only recently settled into a role alongside Smith on First Take. Ravech had been a fixture on baseball coverage for years. Pelissero was one of the most trusted insider voices in the entire league. None of that mattered once the accounting started. Clark was just one of 10 members of the ESPN broadcasting team that was laid off since the start of that week as the cost-cutting exercise took effect. 10 people in 1 week. That's the scale that makes this less about any single grudge or personality clash, and more about a company deciding top-down that the math didn't work with this many names on the payroll anymore. Behind the scenes, there was reportedly a financial logic to the timing too, one that had nothing to do with performance reviews. According to reporting from inside the industry, ESPN would still owe Clark the remainder of his contract, regardless of when they cut him loose. But there was apparently some accounting benefit to making the move now rather than later. A write-off effect that made an already ugly situation feel even colder to the people watching it happen. Whatever the internal spreadsheet logic was, it didn't change how it looked to the people who worked with him, or the people watching from home. And ESPN's own leadership didn't dodge the framing that this was a difficult, top-down business call rather than anything personal. In a memo to employees, ESPN chairman Jimmy Pitaro said, The company had made difficult decisions made about job impacts as it reshaped its operations, while pledging to treat affected employees with compassion and respect. Compassion and respect are one thing on paper. Getting told to call your boss during a commercial break is another. The gap between the memo language and the way Clark's exit actually happened is exactly why this story kept generating headlines days after it happened, instead of fading out like a routine reshuffling would. That contrast is also why Smith's reaction carried so much weight publicly. He wasn't just mourning a colleague, he was in some sense warning the rest of the building. Reports out of the layoffs suggested more departures could follow in the days ahead, with names like Pellicero's floated as at risk before his firing was even confirmed. Smith stood in front of his camera knowing that he wasn't just speaking for Clark, he was speaking into a newsroom that didn't know who was next. That's the backdrop the heads-up conversation sits inside of. Smith wasn't handing Clark some vague rumor pulled out of thin air. He was someone close enough to the layers of ESPN leadership and plugged in enough to the business side of things to sense that a wave like this was coming. Long before the memo, long before the wave actually hit. Now to the part that gives this whole story its shape, what Smith actually told him and when. Clark didn't drop this detail in a press release or a scripted statement. He brought it up himself on his own podcast, sitting across from his own co-hosts, months of silence finally breaking. And the timeline he laid out moves this whole story back by almost a year before the actual firing happened. Clark said he had gotten a heads up about a potential split between himself and the network last summer from fellow ESPN analyst Stephen A. Smith, and he also said he felt there were signs throughout the season regarding his impending dismissal, including a lack of involvement in ESPN's scheduling around the Super Bowl. Think about what that actually means in practice. Smith wasn't reacting to a firing that already happened when he went on his YouTube channel distraught. He'd known in some form for the better part of a year that his broadcast partner's job security was shakier than it looked from the outside. And instead of sitting on that information the way plenty of people in that industry would, he gave Clark something, enough of a signal that Clark, by his own account, started reading the room differently for the rest of the season. That context reframes everything that came after too. When Smith went on camera days later and said he'd fought for Clark behind closed doors, that wasn't the first time he'd tried to protect him. Smith made it clear that he confronted top bosses directly. "I am not happy about this decision one bit. The bosses know I'm not happy about this decision," Smith declared. "I've made that very, very clear. The only thing that I can definitively say to you is that there's nobody that's going to be let go. That was more of a friend and a brother to me than Ryan Clark." And when he saw how people online were piling on Clark once the news broke, treating an 11-year Emmy-winning run like it was some kind of embarrassment, Smith made a point of pushing back on that too. "When I saw how people were talking about him, I was like, they don't know him at all," Smith fumed, adding that Clark was conscientious and thoughtful. That's not the language of a coworker being polite for the cameras. That's someone who'd already spent a year quietly bracing for this exact outcome, and finally letting some of that frustration out in public once it actually landed. Smith didn't pretend the business realities weren't real either. Even as he made his objection known, he acknowledged, almost in the same breath as his frustration, that decisions like this ultimately answer to a bottom line neither of them controls. Smith conceded that executives operating at the direction of parent company Disney ultimately answer to the bottom line, saying decisions like this don't come easy, that they have to be made, and that business is business. That combination, genuine anger on his friend's behalf, paired with an admission that he understood exactly why it happened, is what made his reaction land so differently than a typical "sorry to see you go" post. There's also the detail about how narrow that window of warning actually was in practical terms. A heads up last summer isn't the same as an insider tip the week of. It's more like a friend telling you the ground under your feet. Might not be as solid as it feels. Useful, but not something you can act on immediately. Clark still kept showing up to work every day, still kept doing the job, still got surprised by the exact moment and method, even if the broader outcome wasn't a total shock by the time it came. That's part of why Clark's own reaction, once he finally addressed all of it publicly, carried the weight it did. He wasn't a guy blindsided from zero. He was a guy who'd been carrying a low hum of uncertainty for the better part of a year, courtesy of a friend trying to prepare him the only way he could, and who still had to sit with real emotion once the axe actually fell in the middle of a live show. Once Clark finally spoke publicly at length, the emotion came through in a way that went beyond talking points. Sitting with his co-host Fred Taylor, he was asked something simple, whether there was anything he'd do differently looking back. The question cracked something open. The waterworks started when Fred Taylor asked him if there was anything he'd do differently in hindsight, prompting an emotional response. "That's a good question. It depends on when you ask me. When I see people in public, OGs, aunties and stuff, and they tell me they're proud of me," Clark said before stopping to collect himself. "And they're proud of the way I represent the community. Yeah, I wouldn't change anything, because that means the world to me," Clark continued. It wasn't just Clark who felt it either. The answer had an impact on Channing Crowder, whose eyes welled up too. That same conversation is where Clark drew his hardest line about how this whole thing should be described. He wasn't interested in letting it get filed away under the softer corporate language everyone else was using. He made it crystal clear that he wasn't part of corporate layoffs. He was intentionally fired because some of the powers that be didn't like him. That's a very different accusation than budget cuts. That's Clark saying, on the record, that this was personal for somebody up the chain, whatever the accounting benefits happened to look like on paper. The reactions from around football kept rolling in over the following days, and they split in a way that mirrored exactly how divisive Clark's on-air style had always been. Colorado coach Deion Sanders, a longtime friend, made his feelings known publicly, calling the network's decision to part with both Clark and Cam Newton a mistake. Travis Kelce showed his support in a quieter way, simply liking the first Instagram post Clark shared after the news broke. A short message about waking up, driving to the gym, and getting to work despite everything swirling around him. Clark had been supported by many inside the football world since his firing, including Travis Kelce, who liked his first Instagram post since his termination, in which Clark wrote about getting in his truck, driving to the gym, and getting to work, adding that his peace was with God, and his humility came from within. Not everyone extended that same grace. Nick Bosa, who hadn't posted on social media in years, broke that silence specifically over Clark's exit. After 4 years off the platform, Nick Bosa returned to post about Clark's ESPN layoff, tied back to comments Clark had made criticizing Bosa's MAGA hat before the 2024 election. Bosa shared a link to the Athletic's story about Clark's firing with a single emoji, a hand gesture. It was brief, but it was pointed, and it reignited a fight that had been sitting dormant for over a year. Proof that Clark's willingness to speak his mind on camera had made him both admired and resented across the league in equal measure. So where does that leave the actual claim at the center of all this? What Smith told Clark, and how it lines up with the way it all played out. Clark himself confirmed, in his own words, that Smith gave him something well before any of this became public. A private signal delivered as a friend rather than a network mouthpiece, that his run at ESPN might not last. That warning didn't stop the firing. It didn't even soften the method. Nothing about a commercial break phone call feels soft, but it does explain why Smith reacted the way he did once it finally happened, and why Clark, even through the tears on that podcast, never sounded like a man who didn't see some version of this coming. 11 years, 1 Emmy, 1 wave of layoffs, and 1 quiet warning from a friend almost a year in advance. That's the story Ryan Clark chose to tell in his own words, once he finally decided to stop letting other people describe what happened to him.